All right. Back again. Coming at you. Let me turn off this little window. Coming at you with a relatively low energy day. Jen is sleepy today, and Kyle's getting over a bit of sick phase here. But
Hmm.
Jen and Kyle here with our field notes. Um,
Yeah,
so let's start with ecosystem mapping because you recently, uh, yesterday actually, right? I don't even know what day of the week it is right now.
I know. In the
It's
fog.
I'm not in a fog, and yet I've been thinking it's a day ahead every day this week. So, but you did just facilitate an online workshop slash webinar about ecosystem mapping,
Hmm.
and I'll pause and you can say more about it in a second. But I thought it would be interesting to just talk about this because it is concrete compared to a lot of the things we talk about, and in the spirit of talking about practice, you can get your arms around something like a method. Although, of course, everyone knows very quickly, you try to put your arms around it, it's going to dissolve into a million things and float into the air. But I was going to say, as I joined, I was in the audience for this. I was most intrigued, even before getting into this session, by the notion of even having a session on ecosystem mapping. Because it occurred to me at some point that ecosystem mapping itself
Hmm.
is not something that I associate with a method TM,
Hmm.
right? Which I know you feel the same way, but it's
Yeah.
different than say many, many, many moons ago. We used to give all kinds of trainings when I was at MadPow, whether they were within project relationships or whether they were just standalone trainings on how to do experience mapping, how to do service blueprinting. And never did we ever be like, how to do ecosystem mapping. But somehow it was
Hmm.
always just kind of like a ride along. It was in the sidecar. And later, I started to kind of play with all of these. Like to me, they just all go in the bucket of visualizing a moment or a right now or a something, and they don't always have to be on a time axis, but being able to really explicitly contrast what is a journey or some other chronological flow, linear or not, there's still the implication of time unfolding, rather than mapping a landscape or a metaphorical or literal or an arrangement or a topology
Hmm.
or whatever, so the ecosystem itself doesn't have to be material. So anyway, all that said, I was like, what's Kyle going to actually do here? Because I know it's not going to be a how to. That's not Kyle's
Hmm.
style.
Right.
And then I was kind of curious, like, what would even the theory be, if any? It's not like you weren't going to give a big academic presentation or anything.
Hmm.
But as a audience member, um, I very much appreciated the opening, the presentation at the beginning, which for listeners, you guys can hunt Kyle down if I don't know if they'll have the recording available at some point.
They'll have it up at some
Slides.
point
Okay.
soon. I'll post it to my
Yeah.
LinkedIn.
And you
Yeah.
can rehash some of it if you feel like it. But I mean, largely it was
Hmm.
just to kind of give people an orientation to what it means to think through and use ecosystem mapping as a supportive process, right? Not to generate an
Hmm.
artifact or to bring consensus or alignment into view, anything like that. And it does strike me that there was a talk at the recent information architecture conference that I attended and spoke at a week or two ago in Philly. One of the talks was shitty maps. And it was really in that same spirit of drawing shitty maps, making shitty maps together, intentionally shitty, the provocative,
I
bad
like
word
that.
in the title.
Hmm.
And I forget the speaker's name and I feel terrible, but we could look it up later. It's Joe something, I think. Um, Same spirit of that idea. So I was curious, not so much what you would say about it in the presentation. I think it was well done and compelling, and I think people
Thanks.
appreciate it. The activity was where I found it so interesting. So we got into breakout groups and
Hmm.
in a Miro board, because this was all virtual, we were encouraged by Kyle to share some brief stories about, in this case, you used the theme of first day at work, a first day that we remember. Um, sort of that onboarding. You weren't that specific, but most people kind of went to like, what was it like being on board of that first day?
Hmm.
And in doing that, to have the others in the group listen, identifying keywords, the signifiers of what is meaningful in that experience as it was shared, then to take those keyword signifiers, which we had put on stickies, and either affinitize or just arrange in whatever made sense to our individual group. And I was really interested because I had no idea who the rest of this audience was. In my group, it was clear that some folks live and breathe this kind of work and know exactly what those
Mm-hmm.
instructions mean. And somebody else, was like, so what are we, why are we, what are we sharing on and why? And then in the instructions where, you had them listed in each canvas, what does affinitize mean, et cetera, et cetera. So
Mm-hmm.
beyond merely hashing out and or interrogating the pluses and minuses of even treating ecosystem mapping like a method,
Right.
putting that even aside, just thinking about the sheer like broad gradient of experience people even bring to the notion, that was really intriguing. So I think I mentioned this to you. I think everybody would have benefited from like another half hour at least. It's hard to
Yeah.
cram this kind of thing into whatever it was, 90 minutes.
90 minutes. Yeah.
But so because we're coming fresh off of this, I thought this would be an
Yep.
interesting place to start and share what my experience was as someone who does this all the time and does it almost never as an actual attempt to create an artifact, but does it completely in the spirit of what we're talking about. I kind of like didn't belong in the audience to that extent. I felt like a little bit of like a,
A
spy or
mole.
something. But
Yeah.
I did take in again in that secondary way what others were interacting with, and it was
Mm-hmm.
intriguing to see because there were some folks who were like, okay, well, now that I've arranged these things, and by the way, the stickies, the keywords, they were identified. They represent all different numbers of types of components or actants in a system. So, some of these things were humans, some of them were organizational or community based entities, some of these things were other physical entities, some of these things were non-physical and like, either intangible. They could be feelings that were had, or rituals that were observed, or reflections that someone had.
Mm-hmm.
And that was interesting because some people seemed really at home with like this whole array of things can just be like laid out as I spit out my guts or my brain and I'm looking at it in front of me now. And other people were like, okay, but what am I doing with these now?
Right.
What comes next? Where's the process flow? And
Yeah.
so delightfully there was no delivery on that piece of it. But yeah, I don't know. What were your takeaways at having facilitated it?
Um, it was interesting. I kind of read by what are the questions afterwards? What's the sort of response? How much upheaval is there? And there was very little. It was sort of lukewarm, and so
Mm-hmm.
I kind of walked out saying I don't know how this
Yeah.
actually went. So it's good to hear your response. Um, heard from a few of the hosts also that had a similar sort of read, but I think they had some familiarity as well.
Mm-hmm.
But a few folks have started to reach out and trickle in, and so yeah, I think um, some more time made sense. But the objective around all of this, kind of to your point, I needed to go after the elephant in the room, which is whether or not I want to give that much credence to what ecosystem mapping TM in capitals really is or not. It's something that gets talked about. It's something that people think is a thing. They want to know how to do it. Where is the procedure? Where do I sign up for training? It gets mentioned in certain corners, and people, you find clients and stakeholders that are thinking, we don't have time for that. That's way too, you know, grandiose, or we need that. That's the only thing that's going to capture the vastness of our empire. And at the same time, like all of that is so misdirected and misinformed because it's not really a thing. It's an abstract concept, what an ecosystem map could be, and that's really what I wanted to dispel in all of this. Is that we're really just getting to visual sense making at the end of the day. It's a thing to it's a campfire to gather around and come out with some insights. So there are ways to make that time and that energy spent really valuable. So, what are some good ways to do that? There are also some things that I think were good to call out to say, get away from a normal process. We're not going in and interrogating particular people to say uh, what's the process. Show me the process flow. Diagnose the entire system for me. How does a thing work? But instead going to those stories and being able to break down the difference between clock time and event time, those sort of things. So that's really how I wanted to position the whole thing. Was it's
Yeah.
not really a thing, but if you want to do something that is not your typical swim lanes, your typical service blueprint or journey management or whatever have you, these are some principles to hold that will create something that is different, that supports a different set of questions, that engages at a different level or at a different entry point into your, I don't know, your project, your problem space, if you want to call it that. So I think to an extent it got people thinking in a fun way around that. So that's kind of the response that I've gotten so
Yeah.
far. Is this isn't really, I just wanted to kind of take it's not that scary off of it. And I probably should have spent some more time hammering that one point home. That 30 minutes should have been a little bit more of like, I don't know, uh, like I don't know, firing your first shotgun or something like that, where like you're going to be terrified of it, but after the first one, you're going to kind of go, okay, this isn't that scary. That's a really terrible metaphor. I'm thinking skeet shooting. That's like kind of how you do this sort of thing, but like that was really what it was supposed to be. Like get your, like the kids with the finger painting that are scared of the paint. Like just get your hands dirty, you'll be fine for a minute. You know,
Yeah.
putting your hands in like, well, you're a vegan. I don't. Putting your hands in the raw ground beef. You know, that kind of thing. Once you get there, it's fine.
Well, actually, though, as a metaphor, that's a good metaphor. The finger painting or whatever for a kid who's afraid
Mm-hmm.
to do it because, for whatever extent, like they might very well actually have been made to be afraid of getting something dirty if they've
Sure.
gotten spanked for writing on the wall, or if it's been really driven, hard at home that like this is a clean space and don't make a mess. So it's not just, hey, you try it, get comfortable with it. It is still respecting the context in which it happens, which you understand that very much. But that was part of what I sensed as I was
Mm-hmm.
interacting with the couple people I interacted with as an audience member, that there's definitely that contextual baggage that they bring in. And so the language you use, and the, not you, but that anyone uses, and
Yeah.
the way of thinking, because the notion of, again, and I know we've discussed this here, but for lack of a way to say it, like I bristle a little bit at treating any kind of mapping as a thing. And you just said a
Mm-hmm.
few moments ago, like make it a thing, but it's not a thing. But and it's like you have to pretend a thing is a thing in order to get it in, but then realize it's not a
Yeah.
thing. Like the thingness, oh God, Cameron needs to get involved when we start talking about thingness. But like the thingness of the thing is actually like itself a thing, but not really. And so there's just this
Right.
whole dynamic around being careful that the package or the container that makes a thing importable into a world as a tool, it does actually, it's a lot like onigiri. If you ever have had, like, in Japan, it's basically your sushi little like
Mm-hmm.
snack kind of thing that you get, and it's essentially something in the center, all different type of meat, type of veggie, pickled, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
rice, and then the nori, the seaweed wrapper, and like
Mm-hmm.
the seaweed is the wrapper, but you eat it, it goes. So like you have to
Right.
make sure that like the mapping process that you're bringing
Yeah.
into, or trying together in a self-organizing way, can't have a plastic wrapper on it that contains it
Mm-hmm.
forever. It's got to dissolve, right? And again, you and I
Right.
have talked about it, but it was really on display yesterday because the folks who I could sense were thinking about, oh, I want to use this in my work, use this as in like a tool I hold in my hand, rather than, oh, I want to just do this myself
Mm-hmm.
in my doings, maybe with other people, maybe I don't know. And that was, there was almost kind of like I could see two different contexts from which those people were operating, maybe their business or their environment or their
Yeah.
industry or their training and their background and such. um, I will also say it was interesting, and again, this is a nice, maybe a practical like pro tip for the listeners who are still
Mm-hmm.
listening and actually want something practical once in a while. The move to use stories and anecdotes and to have people listening and identifying keywords is this really useful little, I don't know, flip on the usual, especially if you come from a design background and you're used to doing any kind of visualization of any sort with groups. It's a lot of times just you get in front of a blank canvas and you start identifying what things exist.
Mm-hmm.
And as you've said, there's a lot more you can get if you start by first inviting stories and experiences, and real ones, not just tell me
Mm-hmm.
what the typical first day of work's probably like.
And recent ones, if you
Yeah,
can.
yours, and
Mm-hmm.
hopefully you're inviting, as you've mentioned too many times, the other folks who are impacted by this process, so their
Right.
stories are the substrate too. But when we did this, myself and the other woman who shared initially had very similar experiences, just
Mm-hmm.
weirdly, like from different places and different situations. But we both talked about, as a first day of work, joining a very small company and being a little bit like surprised by how like unorganized and
Mm-hmm.
unformal and a little bit like what the whole experience was.
Mm-hmm.
But both of us coming away from that not with a sense of wow, these guys are, it's like amateur hour chaos over here. We were both like the sense of freedom and like just imperfect human kind of sensibility that representative was, in her case, freeing because she was coming from a far more like restrictive environment, or in my case just really kind of exciting because I could tell these were people who had the right priorities. um,
Mm-hmm.
and I had wondered if other groups were going to see some of those things be as similar as they were or be in contrast with each other. That's a place where we didn't get to because we didn't have the
Mm-hmm.
time. And I know I said this to you at one
Right.
point. 90 minutes is tough. An hour,
Yeah.
you limit yourself to a compelling talk and some discussion, some interaction that way. If you want to do like actual activities in Miro, 2 hours, you know what I mean? But that 90-minute mark
Mm-hmm.
is so tough. You're just in that
It is.
that tough spot.
Yeah.
But that was where I would have also loved to see like another round of mixing or seeing, or the virtual gallery walk or whatever it needs to be. We did the 5 where we kind of just shared, we remixed, but
Mm-hmm.
that was one thing I wondered about, that if I'm doing any kind of, again, visualization or mapping, and I don't set a goal for it because our point isn't to map the current state so we can identify the leverage points. We're truly
Right.
just sense making. That's the piece that I think people aren't always used to, that this can bring in, that has, a systems lens, or our understanding of complex systems that is different than traditional design methods. So we're not
Yeah.
in that designer mindset. We're truly just looking and observing and comparing notes. And in your opening piece, you use the metaphor of maps and how you can understand, if you look at different maps made in different eras or created in different parts of the world, whether or not a map includes a country represented as sovereign or not tells you a lot about who made the map or from what perspective. Multiple truths, pluralities. You made
Yeah.
these points really, really clearly. And I think that ecosystem mapping can be that, but is not necessarily always that. So that's something I feel like
Yeah.
is worth more attention, like in the future and future versions of this, or even just for people who are curious about this kind of a topic, because I never even knew ecosystem mapping was like a thing. It was just a thing I
No,
did.
I
I didn't
know.
learn it in school. It was a natural instinct, like let me just.
Right.
And then over time I'm like, how is Kyle giving a webinar on this? Is this even a thing? And then I was like, oh, I see what he's
I
doing.
I steered into the buzzword, and that's what it really was. It was like especially around Capital One, it was the big buzzword of like,
What's
we
it?
have an ecosystem of things. It's so our kingdom is so vast. Let's
Yeah.
map it. It's all intricate and interlaced, and let's get there. And
Yeah.
all right, we'll do an ecosystem map. And then it looked big and squishy, and they were like, look how massive it is. This is wonderful. It's like, great. What are you doing with it? I don't know. All right, well, then it's not really effective. And I don't know that I'd call it an ecosystem map, but what you call it, whatever you want. You've invested in a bit of sense making. Some of us have done some research to figure some of that out. And I think we talked about this a while ago. One of the big ones that I did for them was around what was it? The tech deployment experience. So after you've done your coding, how do you then get something in so that other users can actually use it? It's now like
Yeah.
platformed and available.
Yeah.
And there were hundreds of nodes on this thing. And so it has to go through like QA and all sorts of risk and audits and all sorts of architecture work and all that stuff that I don't really understand. But none of it worked in concert. It wasn't like a linear path from A to B. It was multiple interdependencies, and it was as each of those interdependencies was available and prioritized. So it was this big star map looking thing.
Yeah.
And the two biggest takeaways were this thing looks like an organism. It looks like an amoeba. And the answer is good. Glad you recognize that. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Don't think of it as an assembly line. It is a living organism within an organization. And they also grasped the degree of the complexity of it. They were sort of in awe of it, and they were uncomfortable by it at the same time. It was sort of both things of this is terrible and awesome that this exists, but there was no other way to illustrate that. There were no bullets that I could build. There was no slide that I could do to
Yeah.
create that would convey that message or that feeling in the same way that that star map did. So in that sense, it was successful, and the response was, I think we need an entire team to start to sort this out. And so this is where internal experiences within the design team came together. So, and it wasn't just now you need to go examine the ecosystem map. It was now you need to go examine the deployment experience and the tech experience and that sort of stuff, and start to figure it out, because we know how integrated it is. So there was it at a very high level. It had the right effect. If I had gone at it at 30,000 feet and put 20 nodes in there, it would have been like, yeah, duh, we get it. You know, you need governance, you need risk and audit, you need budgeting, you need platform. You know, duh, we get it.
You needed to be at
But
the
to
right
get
level
to
of
that level of
granularity.
granularity,
Right.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
what blew it up for them at that
So
right
what
level.
about, and we have talked about this example, but maybe today I want to like, what do you say in response to the argument that like that's a snapshot in time?
Um, well, the response to it, I think, is still correct, because even though the answer wasn't this is where these things exist today, the answer is like those things still have relationships, and if one of those relationships breaks, there will still be some other relationships in there, and so it's not going to thin out aggressively immediately. So it's definitely a snapshot in time. The fact that there was an investment in not formalizing what that was, putting more rigidity to it, but there was an investment in we need to understand this better.
Yeah.
I'm pleased with that.
Yeah.
If the answer was excellent, let's make this into a factory, I would say you're reading this
Right.
all wrong. You don't understand. When you say organism, you don't know what you're saying then.
Right.
So, yes.
And I hear that, and for what it's worth too, I guess probably most people watching this know this, but like the word ecosystem, we're using it really broadly here. Again, it can be an ecosystem of material things. It can be an ecosystem of completely immaterial and intangible things. It can be completely metaphorical. I mean, in theory, it's all of the above. I've known people who do something in this world that they would refer to as relationship mapping or modeling,
Mm-hmm.
or influence mapping, or there's a form of visualization value flow modeling that's not the same as value stream, which is totally different. And so it's not, I think literally it kind of just encompasses like any form of visualizing that is not tied to a chronological arrangement, but any other arrangement, spatial really, or metaphorical spatial. And I think that what I hear when we talk about this is just this like chorus in my head that it's a means to an end. It's not an end. But then I want to hop on top of that and say it's not even a means to an end. It's just a means.
Yep.
Dot 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 to another means,
Right.
to another means, right? And that's
That's
where
it.
I think the difference between operating with an understanding of how humans make sense together, and how complex systems adapt over time, and how self-organization and emergence show up in human systems. That's the difference between a process that bakes that in versus a very conventional design process that says we do our research, we make our journey maps or our maps of some kind, that becomes the blueprint or the recipe for a thing that will then follow. And I don't really know any designer who really operates that way, but we dance around this like thing as if it's something that exists. And so anyway, we're just at this point we're kind of blabbering on about it, but it does strike me that like as we talk about it, there are almost just two versions of every one of these things that are out there. There's the straw man version of ecosystem mapping that people are using the wrong way because they're making the
Right.
poster and then they're expecting it to tell them exactly what to build. Or
Right.
similarly, I mean, I'm never going to hate on journey maps or blueprints because, again, if they're used a certain way, they're really functional. If they
Sure.
are the artifact, the deliverable, what is that? But I feel like that version, in large ways, is straw man. I don't think anybody ever expects those things to become the ends. They just become the ends because people don't have anything else, or other means by which to do work. And so they don't know where else to go. So they just make the map and hope that the map takes care of everything. So I don't know. I'm curious if any of that is like resonant. I mean, we both come from design-ish backgrounds, but different experience backgrounds. So
Yeah. So two things come to mind. I think most of the designers I've worked with, when they're building a journey map or something along these lines, they want good representation. And so there's a discomfort when they can't do that. But stakeholders that we have to hand it off to, there's a good enough sort of
yeah,
expectation sometimes. I don't mind getting to generalities because the product is going to be sort of broad strokes anyway. And so, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good is that
yeah,
statement that I hear all the time. And maybe that is okay to get us unstuck sometimes. And in other cases, that can be really damaging to people that get marginalized. And it kind of depends on,
yeah,
is this an app for buying used cars, or is this something that provides access to healthcare? So
right,
context is everything
right,
again. The other side there was something else that jumped out. Um, I think one of the questions that I hear that provokes the ecosystem mapping conversation usually is the risk management question. Usually, it always, at least coming out of financial worlds for the last almost 15 years, or spending almost 15 years there, it always came down to risk management. But I think a lot of people are in that mindset. Have come from that direction in a lot of cases anyway. It's the, if I pull on this string, what else is going to come with it? It's the, I want to get my hands in here and change some things, but
yeah,
I don't want to break anything that I shouldn't be breaking. And so this is where the I want to see the spider web need comes from. And so I what gets interesting though, that's the prompt for, yes, let me create you the ecosystem map.
yeah,
That's what gives the permission for it. What's interesting though is kind of what you were saying before, the Mandelbrot fractals, the visual of it, the sort of recursive sort of,
yeah,
it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger,
right,
becomes also apparent at the same time.
yeah,
And this is where we get stuck again, where some people that I've provided this for will say, okay, this is a better understanding than I had yesterday and allows me to move forward from where I am. Others continue to want more.
yeah,
And when they find out that there's constantly more and they won't get to the bottom, they panic and freeze and they don't know what to do anymore.
yeah,
But they don't want to ask any more questions because they're afraid to.
yeah.
And then they want to throw it all out the window and just put on the blindfold and fire.
There's a quote that I don't know for I don't even know if he ever said it. It's one of those types of quotes, but John Muir is usually is credited with this quote that when you pull on one thing, the whole world comes with it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so it's just that idea. And I do see that in a lot of the work that I have done, especially further back in time, when a lot of mapping felt like it was having a moment. Like it's not really like
Mm-hmm.
quite like that right now, at least in a lot of my world, but everybody was wanting to create maps as outputs of work. And I think because a lot of folks were kind of like, wow, like there is a lot of power in like visual sense making and sketching, and not to again paint the picture of the future, but just to like make sense. And like everything we understand about semiotics is like, it doesn't have to, we don't have to speak it, we don't have to write it. Like, can we do other things? Right. So there's, there's definitely that instinct. Like if I can map this entire building there, then I will know where all the secret crevices are, and
Right.
I will, nothing will surprise me. We need to make sure, you know, we excavate and understand the floor plan and understand where everything is and where the bodies are hidden and everything. And then nothing can surprise us, you know, to your point
Right.
about risk mitigation. But I also think, because exactly that, inevitably people recognize, uh-oh, like this thing just goes on forever, and
Mm-hmm.
inside every one of those little spots there's the fractal experience. I also think there's this there's like a hump you have to get over at some point that is from the sense making to the decision making. Hackneyed phrase, we're all over it, but like that is still the case, where I think a lot of people get super comfortable in the sense making sandbox, because either because they craved it for so long and didn't have it, and now they realize we can really do a lot here to explore and be divergent and be inclusive of, not, I'm just talking perspectives, but everything, information, you know, et cetera, possibilities. It feels good for a lot of people. It
Mm-hmm.
feels good to explore and to imagine and to share and to include. And if something feels good, we try to find ways to do more of it. So I do think there is a little, and I'm not getting into like inner crap here. I just mean like on a
Right.
purely, you know, biological and cognitive and social sense. You get
Yeah.
that. And then there is that point where you're like, okay, what does this support us in doing? And that is where this huge kind of lightning bolt fracture will happen, where some people will say, I don't know, this whole thing was like a failure if it's defined by guiding some kind of action. Or some people will say, that was all fun, but like now someone's just got to make a fucking decision. Like, and that decision
Mm-hmm.
may have nothing to do with whatever preceded it in the visual sense making. Hopefully that's
Yep.
not the case, but we know that happens all the time.
Oh yeah.
Or, you know, eventually some people start to recognize maybe it's not quite such a clean break, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that this is why increasingly, take estrogen mapping, for example. I do think for some people, the whole concept of identifying and then arranging actants in the way that it happens in the energy time grid is really novel for some folks. You and I have talked about how, like, I think at least for people of the design tradition, mapping constraints and affordances is not novel. Now,
Mm-hmm.
did we ever do it like exactly in the way that Dave has developed? Of course not. I think it is novel and an incredible method, very
Yep.
effective, especially thinking about energy and time, which I think are the
Right.
right axes to get at the gradients and the dispositions of the system, that is actually doable for most like normal humans who don't want to live and eat and breathe like, you know, Latour and
Mm-hmm.
stuff. But designers do a lot of this, just maybe on different axes. And so it's one of the reasons why I took to estrogen mapping very quickly and like wanted to play with it right away. But B,
Mm-hmm.
even before that hit the scene, I was starting to see more and more people who were really effective at crossing that chasm from the sense making to decision making, and not treating them like, you know, successive, but recursive, right?
Right.
Most people who I saw doing that in the design world were playing with forms of mapping that combined both the chronological journeys, blueprints, whatever's, and the ecosystem spatials, which in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of ways to me feels like your E and your T, but just in different forms, right?
Mm.
So I started to notice that, I would say about 10 years ago. I myself was doing it, but I'm not saying this like, oh, I was doing this. I mean, it's just like
Right.
people I worked with, people in client organizations who were also really effective, just people who are really grokking that the sense making and the decision making is a recursive kind of feeding process. We're working with imperfect and never finished, living document versions of what you could call journey maps or experience maps or time-based maps and spatial, influential, relationship-based maps that didn't just include the usual things in an ecosystem like this role or this organization, but did include intangibles that today we would refer to as other forms of actants, the constraints, the constructors, whatever. And they were connecting or showing relationships in ways that, to me, to put together, were doing something that the Estuarine map does on the ET grid. And I find that really intriguing, but I haven't really had a chance to talk to others about it, or I don't know enough designers who've also now immersed in Estuarine, the Estuarine framework to so have you encountered that? Is this the first time you've thought you went at some point? So I guess maybe this is not something you've thought a lot about, but it does strike me that in much the same way that everything is going to evolve to eventually look like a crab, do all roads point to converging the sense making and decision making by virtue of processes and collaboration that look something like this, the combining of the spatial and the chronological or whatever. Space and time are just anyway. All right, that's all done.
You figured it out. Space and time, they're relative. So what I'm thinking, what you're jogging for me is kind of what we've done with design orgs over the last 15 years, maybe, is introduce ourselves. We've wanted to be thought partners forever, not done a very good job at stepping in as thought partners in most cases. Where we've been really successful is coming in and saying, we can help you determine what to do next in terms of, we can do our A/B testing, we can do our user and customer research, we can help map out services, these sort of things. But everything that we're doing, we're getting to an answer at the end of the day. We're collecting data, we're proving out concepts, we're building prototypes and testing those, we're mapping out services, we're getting things from an intangible to a tangible. But it doesn't really, all of that laid out when we come in and we're going to say, well, we're going to help with that sense making and decision making sort of cycle, that's that mush. We'll be sort of coaches and guides through that whole process. That's a very different thing than what we've had on offer for a long time. It's that we want to be thought partners components that we haven't really sold very well, but we've not really positioned ourselves as designers to be that person, the sense-making partner in a process. And we still have the problem of we don't get on the budget until after something has been pitched in terms of, the product is going to be delivered, and, if you give me X amount of money, then these designers are going to deliver, and these product managers and these developers are going to deliver X in return. So that X in return has already been formulated to some extent, and somebody has bought in on it and what that X delivers. So,
I mean, yes and no. So this is where I go, that's the story. We all kind of say, yeah, that's it. But it's a pretty revisionist history in a lot of ways. And I think there's also a collapsing of what we're even talking about when you use the collective we about design.
Sure.
Design as it is in the product and tech world, where you're part of the product design engineering triad, or design as it exists in a bazillion other forms and places that are outside of that and look very different from that. And I know you, Kyle, know this, so this is kind of more pointed at the milieu, but it is kind of, I don't know, it might almost be a red herring even to think about what we've positioned ourselves as, because we didn't position ourselves as anything, because you don't position yourself as anything. You get positioned by virtue of your entangled interactions with the shit around you. So sure. I'm kind of over, and again, this is me just taking things.
Nope, that's fair though.
I'm on this soapbox because you just slid it right under my feet. I'm over this. I'm over it. And I don't participate in it because well, for many reasons that anybody who's watched any of the 20 some odd proceeding can already pick together. But like, I definitely think that we should be careful about reinforcing a revisionist story, though, about the nature of the design world and its practice. Because to get very concrete, I'll give you I probably talked about this example, but what I was saying earlier about like some of the most inspiring and I would call effective design practices that I have observed over the years were doing things like combining the chronological or time-based experiential thinking with more spatial and metaphorically ecosystem oriented in a way that had the same result as an estuarine map, to consider energy gradients, to consider where the flow of influence is one way or another, how to work with the energy of the system again instead of against it.
Mm-hmm.
It was having that impact in places, and it was in places like, I'm thinking of one particular person who led a design practice inside of a healthcare org, and she had them as partners to many outside of their practice. Everybody always wants to use that language. They didn't just like map the experience of, they had different journeys, right? That they might have defined, like get care, do this, do that, whatever. And they didn't just map the journeys, they engaged in world building. They were using some of the language of game design because of backgrounds
Mm-hmm.
people shared. You have to use whatever language is there. And they engaged in world building, and world building literally, not just describing, but designing visually representations of the
Hmm.
quote unquote world in which people, not just patients or members, but everybody and everything around them in the ecosystem of care interacted. And so it was a design practice full of design practitioners who were engaged in world building, which was a combination of chronological experience journeys and ecosystem arrangements of entities, and mushing them together in ways that the visualizations that they were maintaining were always changing, living systems. I mean, they can't change constantly because then no one will ever reference them, but they were in like Miro boards or the equivalent unfinished, okay to edit form.
Mm-hmm.
And people weren't using them just as reference materials to go off and then design a series of screens that follow a flow and have the interaction pattern be consistent, but they were using them as thinking tools. And so when there
Right.
was something happening outside the boundary of this design team, that somebody somewhere else would say, well, what is happening inside this healthcare world in which our members or our customers, impacted people, are living? And it strikes me to this day how it's a completely parallel alternative version to identify your actants, put your actors, constraints, and constructors on your
Mm-hmm.
energy time grid, and identify the dispositional state, the energy gradients, what's within reach and what isn't, and then identify, it's like not the same, and they could probably both happen and be complementary, but the means by which people independently have figured out that we maybe shouldn't peel apart space and time is just very present to me right now. And like the ecosystem mapping up webinar was a good trigger to think through this, because regardless of how we as designers will get and continue to get boxed in, which I shouldn't, again, I don't even feel like I have the right to say we anymore, because I don't know if I'm in the club anymore. I don't know if they would let me into the design club. If I went and
Yeah.
knocked on the door, they'd be like, girl, get out. So I don't know. I humbly defer to whether the design
I
team.
think they would welcome you back. I think you're there.
But I think at the end of the day, the practice looks a lot more like integrating these things rather than peeling them apart, which is what I think folks have had to pretend that it was for a long time. So I don't know. I should shut up for a
I think
second.
that's fair. I hope so. The romantic in me certainly wants for that. The skeptic in me that's been in a number of organizations in the last few years, and have seen a lot of very talented creative people being asked to, should this be a blue button or a red button,
Yeah.
is a little bit, has been emboldened. And I
Not design.
don't like to feed the cynic,
Yeah.
but
That's just not design. And I think
yep,
I don't blame anybody who's ended up in that role for like taking that role thinking it was more, it
right,
was different. I mean, this is as we've talked about, an evolution of an industry, but
yep.
yeah, that's not design. It's just production.
No, it is not. Um, what I think you had to go we didn't have a hard stop. You had a hard stop when the 90 minutes was up. We hung out. We did another like 30 minutes of after hours.
Oh
They
yeah.
turned off the
Ah,
yeah. So there was a little bit of nerding out afterwards, and they turned off the recording. So none of this it was captured. But there was a really great question from somebody about like how do you sort of introduce this? How do you walk into the usual question that
yeah. How
comes
do I
up in most things?
spell? How do I get permission? How do I find
Yeah.
co-conspirators?
How do I get this on board with my clients and stakeholders? Exactly.
Don't
Um,
do it.
and it wasn't, let's plan out the big grandiose, 2-day workshop, fly everybody into New York and put them up in hotels and commit to having big answers when you're done and massive artifacts. And it wasn't do the world building either. Like none of those things. So just like when you've got the rigid, I don't know, visualization of something and it doesn't work and everyone's bothered by it, draw a squiggly line on it. And that's the first sort of step. It's that simple, I think, is to start sort of breaking the mold of the old tool to just repurpose a little bit of what's there. And it will make some people uncomfortable, but it will also show the incompatibility of the current tool set to represent if it's not working. And that's the caveat. Is like if somebody if we're and this is where I first started doing this was looking at swim lanes and people were going, yeah, but what happens when people divert and go in different directions?
Yeah.
How do we want to represent that? And the answer was this doesn't do it. We have to make a mess here. And the squiggly lines became more overpowered the straight lines before we were done. And so it needed to take on a different form
Yeah.
altogether. But it wasn't because I was saying we're doing ecosystem mapping. It was because I was listening to feedback and basically just being the scribe from people for
Yeah.
what I was hearing and trying to illustrate that in a way that people could get behind it and say, yes, I feel represented now. It's on paper. That's one way. Another is just to kind of like almost do the sketch notes when you're listening to people, just to kind of say, this is a visualization. Did I get this right? And if the answer is no, like, excellent. Let's get our hands dirty
Here's
and
your
fix
pencil.
this.
Go. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well,
Yeah. Keep playing with this.
that's so maybe this is a tangent, but we're going.
Good.
And a couple of our recent conversations have hit on this, and this is always out there. We got to get over the permission thing, guys.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at all of you out there. Like, quit looking for fucking permission.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that most people would probably rightly respond, Jen, we're not cowering in fear waiting for permission, but it's simply that we don't have the environment, the affordance, the ability to do this. We don't have the tools or the resources. We don't have the leeway. We don't have the runway, or there's actually disincentives. And if I do certain things that are outside of what I'm chartered to do, I put my livelihood at risk. I put my ability to pay my mortgage and feed my kids at risk. And all of that's true. But I think there's a pretty long, broad distance between what Kyle just described and making someone angry and losing your job, or, even sometimes I kind of want to be like, have you all ever actually just gotten reprimanded by anybody? Like, have you all ever done anything enough to just have anybody tell you, like, don't do that again? Because, like, if you haven't done that, then don't come anywhere near me with the how do I convince my blank to help let me do this. Like, there's a long road from I got a side eye or my boss was kind of displeased with me to I'm fired. And I think we're all operating like an insane state of fear right now. So like I have like the utmost compassion for the incentives and the constraints that everybody is working within. But I can't help but feel like, especially in the last few years, there's this like implied, I'm looking for either permission or opportunities. And you make both. And it's easier to do with co-conspirators. And as we've talked about a lot, you don't recruit and train up your co-conspirators. You become a magnet for them by embodying the things you want to see happening. And then you glom together like molecules. And before you know it, you're forming some kind of giant creative molecule that's I don't know, a magnet and a crystal and all the other metaphors in one. So I don't know, like I didn't expect this to be the thing today, but I'm kind of just like, God, fuck permission. What are we doing, people? Why are we waiting for it? That's my passionate plea to everybody out there to like just quit. And I maybe invite response because this is always a place where I am willing to be humbled and continue to grow and to enhance the humility that I can operate with. I have been in environments where I would have responded pretty strongly to my own statements just now, but
Mm-hmm.
with years of experience beyond, I stand by what I just said. So I don't know. That's my
Well,
that's my
here,
stake today.
I'll I know you don't like devil's advocate,
I
so I
love
won't
it.
play that.
Go, just go. You can call it what you want.
Well, so I will go back to a Kyle of 2015 where I was still a punk, but I was probably more of the Don Quixote level punk, where it was all or nothing.
Don Quixote and
And
a
I didn't.
mohawk is what we want.
Yes, with a mohawk and
Safety pins and a little
a
plaid pleated
botch
floor.
shirt.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we love it.
So it, I think part of the problem is not, some of it is the permission, without a doubt. The other part that I ingest, because I lived it, was I didn't understand the value of small moves. And
Okay.
and we've talked about this,
Yeah.
and the the metaphor, lose the battle, win the war,
Yeah.
but
Do the wrong
I don't,
thing in order to earn the right to do the right thing. Yeah. You're looking
bingo.
for bigger symbolic or meaningful or visible things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those are components as well. So there were times that, like, it seemed to me that something very linear was not going to solve the problem beforehand,
Mm.
and I wanted to dig my heels in right then. We haven't even started, and I'm going,
Yeah.
that's not the answer. We're
Yeah.
going to do something different. And it was just, we're going to fight this out. And I'm fighting uphill. I'm fighting straight up the org chart. And eventually it was like,
Yeah.
I I mean, like, this is a competency problem, or we're going to find somebody else,
Yeah.
or
Well,
shut the fuck up. We're paying you. Just do it. Like, those sort of things.
yeah.
I had to kind of like,
Yeah.
it took, I had to learn right.
Yeah.
Let me show you what this looks like when we are going to do exactly what you're asking for. But it's one of the things you're asking for. You're also asking for these other three things that don't
Yes.
fall into this, that aren't supported by this. So now what? And when we get
Yeah.
there, then we can have a conversation about what I'm talking about. And I will have other opportunities. It's not just that one. And
Yeah.
that's kind of it. There's a long timeline of opportunities and problem spaces and interactions that'll allow for us to introduce things at different levels to
Yes.
different people. That
Different
one person,
granularities, different pace layers, all the
yeah,
things we've talked about.
right,
So everything you've just said, right, strikes me too as, I know how this is going to sound, but if somebody has fallen in love with or fallen down the rabbit hole into systems and in particular complexity, one of the most relevant things we know from the study of complex systems is this notion of the energy gradients of a system. And to me, when folks are operating in the way you've just described, and we've joked a lot about how there's kind of this, we all have to kind of go through that like phase, but to me it's not just this kind of fun haha, like we all go through the phase, we pick up our passion and we're off and running with our pitchforks and but if you are a serious student of complexity, or even if not that, of human sense making and collaboration, then you have an obligation to continue that study until you have fully internalized in your practice. I don't mean inner development, I just mean into your work, that very fact that you have to work with the energy of a system if you actually want to see some kind of desirable outcome emerge. And when I see people continue repeatedly, I mean, there's kind of like a a patience, or there's like a, there's a period of time where you'll kind of offer someone some grace to work through their Don Quixote phase. But after a certain point in time,
You're just
it
an
tells
asshole.
me you're not learning, and you're not actually, like I say, I don't just mean there's there's like an ethical obligation to me that if you are going to want to bring certain forms of study and implication from all these important fields into your work for the benefit of humans, then you have an obligation to actually like honor what the science says, and that is at play here. So I think it's a really good point you make too, right? Not just about the permission thing, but that eventually, if you really truly grok what it is you're claiming to want to pull into your practice, then you've got to examine where in your practice do you need to figure out how to work with the energy of a system, even if it like feels icky sometimes. Like, get over the ick if you're committed to actually using certain forms of work and practice to benefit other humans. What's more,
Mm-hmm.
there's like this saying in like relationship stuff, like, would you rather be, right, or rather be happy, or whatever. Like, if you have a fight, is it more important that you're
Mm-hmm.
right in this argument, or is it
Right.
more important that, whatever, you demonstrate some kind of care, or whatever it is? There's a million scenarios where
Mm-hmm.
that gets used, but it's kind of the idea here. Is it more important that you avoid the ick and the moral, or whatever practice based gray zones, or is it more important that you achieve desirable outcomes for human well-being and flourishing? And to be very frank, that's a decision you get to make. There are times where I think it's a perfectly reasonable choice to say, I'm going to stick to a moral high ground here, even if it means that I don't accomplish anything. That's your choice. That's your choice. But I think you've got to be aware of that choice and make it consciously. Otherwise, I don't really want to know you. you know? So interesting though that like this hits a little, we don't want to get into this today, but Snowden's like recent two posts where he's getting into a little bit about the tensions in practitioner
Mm-hmm.
and leadership roles, and that notion of, we've said, you're not in traffic, you are traffic, you're of the
Mm-hmm.
substrate, and so that and to take that a step further around the tension between, a convened session or a container, and the problematic implications of that are in complete, contrast or tension with what an actual, I don't know, complexity, anthro-complexity based approach to work should be, which I'm fully like on board and of that. I like stand Dave's stance on this, I guess I'll say, which is weird because I'm not always like that, but it's relevant here because I do think that's a big part of it, is for folks that are starting to kind of grapple with changing their own posture within the work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to say that and not have it get interpreted as like, change your mindset about what you're doing. And then it's like, nah, man, it means like what we just said: quit waiting for permission, quit tilting at windmills, be
Yeah.
mad about something, be mad at me saying don't be such a baby and wait for permission, and then be mad at something enough that you'll go do stuff about it.
Well, I think you said it a couple weeks ago. Like, you don't need permission to live it, and
Just embody it.
living it, yeah, like that's living it affects it. So we say all the time we need to eat our own dog food, and
Yeah.
we've seen this numerous times where we've brought other practitioners together. We've tried to facilitate something with some ambiguity, and people get real tense and squirrely. Like,
They don't
we're
like it.
we're we're doing this. What's the objective? What are you asking for me? And we're going, let it go. We're like,
What's
we
it?
don't know
What's it, Kyle? What are we talking about?
what
What's
needs to be
it?
let go.
What
It
is
it
what is it? What is living it and not asking for permission for it?
living it. So living it is that's a excellent question. Let me think about that for a second. So I think in the context that we're talking about, it's first realizing that long time scale, and that change is not cause effect. So the objective that we're looking for, there's not a direct route to it, and the effect that we're looking for is not going to be sort of like it's not chess. It's not three moves out. It's nothing like that. And so we are going to have an action, and it's going to have multiple unforeseeable reactions. But that's what we're just sort of sensing and responding in that sense. And so the ideal scenario is we're just remaining highly sensitive and like Dave and Frozen like to say, doing the next right thing. So that's I think that's a good start in
Yeah.
living it.
Yep.
The other is to remain sort of, I don't, open might not be the right word. I think really respecting the agency and the sovereignty of everybody else that you're colliding with in this space. I still find a lot of people in our very local neighborhood that are still like, why can't these idiots just get on my level? Not quite to that extent, but that's what I hear because I bristle at the impatience. And I do get it. And I definitely have been there. Certainly in the beginning when I was like, I can now see the matrix. I've ascended and I see it now. And now I'm like, oh, that's shit. That's not it. So it took a little bit to get off my high horse. It wasn't long that I was there, but I was certainly there. Um, but the idea that like everybody just needs to see the thing that I see, and then we'll all get along and it'll be fine. That needs to go ahead. Like the fact that people are seeing and experiencing other things is room for learning and curiosity, and it's another condition to work with and to figure out, well, how do we repurpose this relationship to something that becomes that next right thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of living it. Not It's not a problem that needs to be overcome. It's not a barrier between that next objective or that ideal future states,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that means. It's how do we navigate these conditions? Ideal, like in a, I don't want to say idealistically, beneficially.
Yeah.
Um, there will be more.
But
What
that
comes to mind for you?
no, I mean that's I just kind of because I while we're talking, I can always hear in the back of my mind my like little fake listener kind of being like, Jesus Christ, you guys are talking about like asking for permission for it and living it and like what the fuck are you on about? And I mean,
Good.
again,
This is a great question.
I'd like to think folks who are already like watching this kind of have some context for it, but I do think everything you just said, head nods. I think it's really hard. So it's easy to say the words that we say about
Mm-hmm.
learning your way forward and dispositional states and getting away from goal and target oriented work and having a sense of direction instead of a future vision. And it's easy to say these words, but especially in the workplace, it's a whole nother thing to like walk around being like, fuck your goal oriented whatever, blah, blah, blah. Like, yeah, you're gonna get fired. um so quit your job and start your own company. No,
Get
but
fired anyway.
but I that's why I want to challenge you and me to periodically do this, because what you've just described, is probably a lot of people would be like, yeah. But at the end of the day, you might still have to go into the office virtually or literally, and you might still have to put together that report that is like the actual opposite of what Kyle just said. And I think the point I want to like really drive is that that doesn't mean you're not doing it or you're not embodying it. That this is the whole notion of contradiction and plurality, and the fact that you can be engaging in practices that are part of a current state while at the same time sort of prefiguratively also embodying what you think could be a more desirable future version of something. And it doesn't have to line up. Things don't have to be reconcilable. And that is like, if there's nothing else, like that to me is so key. And this maybe comes out of some conversations I've even had with people in the last couple of weeks that's probably coloring this. But I am observing, I think, more folks who have gotten interested in either complexity specifically, or even just, I know a few folks who are just getting into like systems thinking, which,
Mm-hmm.
I have to kind of like bite my tongue about
Right.
that. But it's a nice thing that folks are going, wait, I want to learn more about systems thinking. And they're just getting to that point where they're doing exactly what you described early, Kyle, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and this is why when we get into conversation, I this is largely what I try to say to them, but I'm trying to be a little bit more, I don't know, more concrete for them, which is to say, yeah, you're still going to have to make that PowerPoint slide that writes out what is the hypothesis you're trying to validate in your research.
Right.
And you are going to have to do the dumb brainstorm and the future visioning exercise where you create a narrative storyboard that describes the future experience that you're going to try to deliver, even though we all know it can't work that way. You can do those things and it doesn't radically undermine your
Mm-hmm.
ability to do other things like Kyle's description of ecosystem mapping that doesn't need to be a big process TM that has a spot in the timeline of the Gantt chart. It could just be something you do on your own and maybe share the Miro board with a few of your teammates and say, what do you guys make of this? You got anything you'd add or take away? Do it in the 5 minute downtime you have right at the beginning or the end of lunch. Like these things can live on top of each other, like two photographs superimposed. And sometimes that's even richer than operating on some kind of like beautiful estuarine metaphor that everybody has read every book on complexity and understands all of it deeply. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's gonna be some good sound bites from this one where I'm telling everybody to quit waiting for permission. We're gonna put that on LinkedIn. Just want to
That's
make
a good start. I mean, absolutely. I think so. I'll say that I don't want to say I was waiting for permission. I want to say there was a big shift for me where I went from uh, petulant punk
yeah.
to I kind of I'm feeling emboldened and confident at a different level, and that was probably tripping over a lot of not just Dave's work, but then like 5 minutes after finding Dave's work, I found
Mm-hmm.
Alicia and Nora
Laura, yeah,
and
everybody, yep, yep,
Schmachtenberger and
yep.
all of that, and went like, this is the stuff that I probably had some sort of stick figure imagination of at some point, at least a 10% of what I'm hearing, but it's all clicking for me now. And I'm hearing that there are actually like, there's real studies on this. There's real science behind
Yeah.
this. There's a history to this. Like, shit, now I'm not just postulating in front of a whiteboard in front of a bunch of people that when they shoot me down, I'm like, I don't know, I'm just guessing here. Now I can sit down and say confidently, like, I learned this shit and it's real. And so
Science.
I'm sharing it.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah,
it went from me saying, I bet that we we probably like adhere to our mythology to some point. And people are like, no, it's bullshit. And I was like, all right, maybe it's bullshit. Now I can sit down and say, have you ever heard of assemblage theory? Let's talk about this a little bit. Let me share some thoughts
how
on
does that
like,
go?
right. And well, now because I'm not just scratching my head and saying, I wonder,
Yeah,
it goes very, very differently. And I know what context to bring it up in
right,
too, and
yes,
with the right people and very different language. And I've got my own
yeah,
experiences that I can connect to it. So it's a whole different conversation, but
yeah,
that it wasn't permission that I needed from
no,
a superior, from a anyone within my local orbit,
yeah.
but I did need a an infrastructure
Yeah, and
that
that's
didn't
partly
exist
why I
before.
think I was pretty quick to caveat earlier too. I don't literally mean permission. It's not permission from above.
Yeah,
It's
and I think it was
social
clear
permission.
what you were talking about.
You need collaborators. You want co-conspirators. You want, so it's kind of like looking for the resources, whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is. Yeah, totally. You know what this is kind of reminding me though, and I think we might have. I can never remember what we've talked about on recording or
I know.
outside of it, but just when
It's
you
all
were
right.
talking
It's
about
within this context
being
now.
the
It's
punk,
different.
that notion of being a conformist or anti-conformist and
Mm-hmm.
nonconformist. And
Mm-hmm.
I probably told this story, but I remember once when I was young, like in high school or middle school, a friend once said to me, because we were talking about being like outsiders or whatever, and she was like, "Yeah, but Jen, I think you're like you're not anti-conformist because the people that I would describe as being anti-conformist are like making whatever decision they do still based on what everyone else is doing. They just choose to do the
Mm-hmm.
opposite, sort of that like polarity thinking." And she was like, I would describe you being as more non-conformist, just in the sort of like general, like you just do your own thing. And I mean, I'm not sharing this to be
Right.
like, look at me in high school, I was not. No, it's just more like it struck me because it
Right.
was an interesting like addition of a third thing that I went,
Hmm.
And then of course, in certain Eastern spiritual traditions, you get your concept of the difference between attachment and like non-attachment is not detachment. So
Hmm.
you think in Buddhist tradition around, people hear and they throw the word around, but like being detached is different than non-attachment. And so I think maybe in the spirit of that, there's a little bit of that at work, even in describing when you were like, I was like the punk. I think there's a lot of the way things are isn't working. And suddenly we
Right.
find, wherever we find them, not just complexity in systems, but other practices and approaches that are out there, I'm not going to name, but like everybody kind of finds a thing and they go, this isn't working. Your Newtonian mechanical blah, 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 blah is not working. And so then this is the thing. And you put yourself in danger of being as reductionist, but in the other direction. And so what is that third? I don't know, get into the trilemma and the trialectic, but just that may be a big piece of this that maybe warrants me thinking through a little bit more in the future, because there's I don't want to get it into like, oh, now we're all Buddhist non-attachment, like blah blah blahs, but there's a version that can hold all of that in one place and
I
hold
think
all
you're
of it.
absolutely right. And I wish I had talked about this a little bit yesterday. I had it in mind, but was a little off my game yesterday. But
COVID will do that
the
to you.
yeah, well, um, I I try to make it a point in just about every presentation to identify that what I'm presenting is not um, a indictment on other tools or methodologies or anything else. It's not to say like your form of research is bullshit. This one is superior. We're going to mow that down and never do that again. We're going to do this instead. Or I'm proposing we replace X with Y. It's
You'll never make a good
that
consultant.
nope, no, probably not. But it is we are stretching X probably too far, and I think we were all admitting that,
Yeah.
whether we're saying it out loud or not. We've heard this long enough that X gets stretched too far. So here's an adjacent set of tools or methods or way of approaching things that allows us to not have to do that anymore and pick up a different tool instead. We don't have to use a hammer to pull the screws out anymore. We can use a screwdriver. And that's I think what you're talking about
Yeah.
is it's that third space of acknowledging that there is a place, at least for now, for what's been going on. At least we're not going to just jump ship on it
Yeah.
immediately, and that's okay. Um, but it's also not buying into it
Yeah.
as being the way.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think that last piece
Third
is really
space.
key just too, because like I even get a little weird about even just this conception of it, because it risks making it sound like, well, it's not polarity and A or B, it's the beautiful marriage and integration of both of them. And it's not that either. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this is one of the reasons why I don't know if we've talked a lot about like polarity thinking on the recordings, but like maybe that's a good topic for another time. But I
Mm-hmm.
don't love a lot of what I see in the like polarity thinking frameworks, because I think they just engender like platitude and compromise that feels
Yeah.
good but isn't really like productive, and it's not
Right.
harmful, so it's kind of like I don't really want to poo poo it, but I think it lends itself too easily to like, no, it's both. It's just it's everything. Everything's everything. And I mean, it's important, I think, for some people to even just recognize that like things can be more than one thing at once. I mean, that's probably where it belongs, is just to have that step of understanding. But I do, I want to be careful too, not to imply that like, I'll take your polarity and raise you to the integrated center, that it is everything, and that's not what I'm saying either, and it's not what you're saying either, but just to suggest that like maybe add some dimensions beyond the two, you know
Absolutely.
some orthogonal z-axes and such, and that's where most of this stuff becomes real. So I don't know. Anyway, I gotta go in a couple minutes. So anything, I am truly actually gonna say if there's any final words you want to have the final mic drop, you can have it.
I don't have a final mic drop. I think I don't have one.
Well, that's probably the most complexity informed way to end of all. I'm gonna hit stop right now.
Just slam it. Yeah.